The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, their light bouncing off polished marble floors and echoing against the tall windows dressed in velvet drapes. Rows of round tables stretched across the room, covered in crisp white linens, their centers adorned with fresh bouquets and gleaming glassware. The hum of polite conversation filled the air, punctuated by bursts of laughter from well-dressed men and women who spoke with the confidence of people accustomed to being heard. It was the annual National Education Conference, an event where policymakers, superintendents, and celebrated professors gathered to discuss the future of America's schools. For many, it was a place to network, to impress, to showcase. For one woman, however, it was something else entirely. She was a teacher, a middle-aged woman with streaks of grey softening the edges of her dark hair, lines of fatigue etched gently around her eyes. She wore a simple navy dress, pressed but not new, and shoes that had carried her through countless school hallways. She had no entourage, no glossy brochure to hand out, no reputation that preceded her. What she carried instead was experience. Years spent in overcrowded classrooms with peeling paint and broken desks, years buying pencils and notebooks with her own money, years of holding back tears so her students would never see how the system had failed them. She entered the grand hall quietly, clutching her registration badge like a ticket she wasn't sure would be honored. Heads turned briefly, scanning her plain clothes, then turned away. She found her seat near the back, at a table half filled with people she didn't know. They glanced at her politely, then angled their chairs toward one another, conversations resuming as if she were invisible. On stage, a speaker droned on about innovation in education, words laced with jargon and statistics. He spoke of technology integration, funding models, standardized outcomes, phrases that sounded polished but hollow to someone who had spent the morning grading essays written on torn notebook paper. She listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her heart sank. The gap between what was said in rooms like this and what happened in classrooms like hers felt wider than ever. When the floor opened for questions, a line formed at the microphone. Suits and blazers, confident strides, rehearsed voices. She hesitated, then rose, her knees trembling. She told herself she had as much right to speak as anyone here. She walked to the microphone, the sound of her modest heels muffled against the carpet, and waited her turn. Finally, she stepped forward. The spotlight caught her face, sudden and harsh. She cleared her throat. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "My name is Margaret. I'm a public school teacher in a rural district." There was a rustle in the crowd, a few raised eyebrows. A teacher? Most of the people who attended this conference were administrators, academics, or politicians. Rarely did classroom teachers stand at these microphones. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've taught for over 20 years. I've seen classrooms grow more crowded while resources shrink. I've watched children come to school hungry, without books, without jackets for the winter. I've bought supplies out of my own paycheck because no one else would. And while we sit here talking about data points and projections, those children are still waiting for someone to see them." Her words hung in the air. For a brief moment, silence wrapped the room. Then came the chuckles. A man in an expensive suit leaned toward his colleague and whispered something that drew a laugh. A woman in pearls shook her head, smirking, as if the teacher's words were naive. Near the front, one superintendent rolled his eyes so dramatically it drew murmurs, and from the stage, the moderator gave a thin, practiced smile. "Thank you for your comment," he said smoothly. "But let's keep our questions focused on policy implications." Policy implications. The phrase landed like a slap. She felt heat rising in her face. "With respect," she replied, gripping the microphone, "policy doesn't matter if it doesn't reach the children. What's the point of a reform that never touches the classroom?" The chuckles grew louder. Someone muttered, "Idealistic." Another said, "She doesn't understand the system." Her chest tightened, but she held her ground. The moderator shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to move on. "We appreciate your passion, ma'am," he said, already turning to the next questioner. She stepped back, heart pounding, humiliation washing over her. She walked to her seat, the stares following her like shadows. Some were amused, some annoyed, most dismissive. No one applauded. No one nodded in agreement. She sat down, staring at her folded hands, fighting the sting of tears. But even as the speakers resumed and the room carried on as though she hadn't spoken, something inside her stirred. The laughter, the dismissal, the smirks, they hurt, yes. But they also ignited something deeper, something stronger. Because she knew her students' faces, she knew their struggles, and she knew that what she had said was true. The conference would forget her words within the hour, but she would not forget their laughter, and one day, she vowed silently, they would remember her. Long before the chandeliers and marble floors of that conference hall, her world had been chalk dust and squeaky desks, bulletin boards patched with faded construction paper, and the endless hum of fluorescent lights. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't celebrated, but it was hers. Her classroom sat at the far end of an old red brick school in a district most people forgot when they drew maps of success. The paint on the walls peeled in corners, the windows rattled when the wind pushed hard, and the heating system groaned like an old man with aching bones. Some mornings in winter, she kept her coat on for the first hour, waiting for the radiators to wheeze themselves awake. The textbooks stacked on her shelves were older than most of her students, their covers worn, their pages yellowed and scribbled with the notes of children who had long since graduated. Yet when the bell rang and the students filed in, her eyes lit up. She saw not what was lacking, but what could be. Children of farm workers, factory hands, single parents working 2 jobs. They arrived with second-hand backpacks, sometimes without pencils, sometimes without breakfast, sometimes carrying burdens far too heavy for their young shoulders. And yet, they were her reason. "Good morning, class," she'd say, with a smile that cost her nothing but gave them everything. She meant it every time. Her voice carried warmth into the room, like sunlight through dusty blinds. She learned quickly that teaching wasn't just about math or grammar. It was about seeing each child, recognizing their needs, their fears, their hopes. When one boy kept falling asleep in the back row, she didn't scold him. She asked questions, learned that his parents worked nights, and he cared for his little sister until midnight. When a girl acted out, shouting at classmates, she didn't punish first. She discovered the girl's father had left, and her anger was a shield for her grief. In those moments, she became more than a teacher. She was counselor, advocate, sometimes even parent. She kept granola bars in her desk for the hungry ones, extra pencils in a jar for the forgetful ones, tissues for the ones who cried quietly when they thought no one saw. She decorated the classroom with what she could afford. Bright posters bought at garage sales, inspirational quotes handwritten on colored paper, a small bookshelf filled with paperbacks she had collected over the years. She wanted her students to feel that even if the world outside was cold and indifferent, within these 4 walls they were valued. Her paychecks never stretched far enough, but that didn't stop her. On weekends, she clipped coupons, drove to discount stores, and bought supplies with her own money: markers, notebooks, crayons. She told herself it wasn't charity, it was investment. Investment in children who deserved a chance. She never mentioned it to colleagues. It wasn't something she boasted about. It was simply what needed to be done. There were triumphs, small but unforgettable. The boy who once sat silent in the back discovered he loved to write stories, filling notebook after notebook with superheroes who bore suspicious resemblance to himself. The girl with the sharp tongue learned to channel her voice into debate, winning local competitions. A shy student who barely whispered her answers in September stood proudly in front of the class by June, delivering a presentation with trembling hands but steady courage. Every year she carried their victories with her. Every summer she thought of those who still struggled, wondering if she had done enough. And every fall, when the doors opened again, she started over with a new group, determined to try harder, to give more. Outside the classroom, few noticed. Parents thanked her occasionally, though some were too tired or too burdened to attend conferences. Administrators sent emails about test scores, budgets and forms. Politicians on television talked about education in sweeping statements, none of which reflected the reality of her classroom. The wider world rarely saw her, but her students did, and that was enough. One memory stayed with her, above all. A boy, no older than 10, had lingered after school one day. His shoes were too small, his backpack frayed. He shuffled his feet, then looked up at her with wide, earnest eyes. "Miss," he said softly, "when I grow up, I want to be a teacher like you. 'Cause you make me feel smart." She carried those words in her heart, like a medal. No award, no paycheck, no conference recognition could match them. Still, the years wore on her. The endless demands, the shrinking resources, the quiet disrespect from those who thought teaching was easy. She grew tired, her body aching from long days, her spirit weary from fighting a system that seemed indifferent. And yet, every morning, she walked into her classroom and greeted her students with that same smile. Because she believed, stubbornly, fiercely, that education was the key. Not for statistics, not for politics, but for children whose futures depended on someone who believed in them. And if the world refused to see her worth, she would still give it anyway. One lesson, one child, one day at a time. That was her life. Not glamorous, not celebrated, but profoundly meaningful. And it was this life, this relentless devotion, that made the scorn she endured at the conference cut so deep. They dismissed her as if she didn't matter. But if they had stepped into her classroom, even for one day, they would have seen the truth. She mattered more than they could ever measure. The longer she taught, the more she realized that teaching was as much about endurance as it was about inspiration. It wasn't just about standing at the blackboard, chalk in hand, explaining fractions or grammar rules. It was about carrying weight, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, that most people never bothered to notice. Her salary arrived on the first of every month, modest to the point of insult. After rent, utilities, and groceries, there was little left. And yet somehow, she always found herself in the school supply aisle at the discount store, a basket in her hand filled with crayons, pencils, glue sticks, and notebooks. She never liked to calculate how much of her own paycheck disappeared into those aisles. To her, the cost was secondary. What mattered was that on Monday morning, when her students walked in, they would find sharpened pencils waiting in the jar, fresh paper stacked neatly on the shelf, and a classroom that told them they were worth more than the system gave them. It wasn't just money, it was time. She spent nights hunched over stacks of papers, red pen in hand, eyes burning from exhaustion. Weekends vanished into lesson planning, calls to parents, searching for creative ways to stretch a budget that never stretched far enough. While friends spent evenings out or traveled on vacations, she stayed home, surrounded by manila folders and textbooks, her dining table transformed into a war room for learning. The sacrifices seeped into her personal life too. Invitations went unanswered. Relationships grew strained. People outside the profession rarely understood why she worked so hard for so little in return. "It's just a job," one friend once told her. She had smiled politely, but inside, the words stung. Teaching was never just a job. It was a calling, a responsibility, a vow to children who depended on her. But that explanation rarely satisfied anyone who hadn't stood in her shoes. Sometimes, she overheard the way society spoke of teachers. On the news, commentators complained about test scores as if they were proof of laziness. Politicians debated education budgets as though teachers were numbers on a spreadsheet instead of human beings shaping lives. At the grocery store, she once listened as two customers grumbled about teachers and their summers off, as if those months weren't filled with workshops, planning, and part-time jobs to make ends meet. She didn't interrupt. She just kept her head down, her hands tight on the handle of her cart, swallowing the bitterness like medicine. Yet the hardest part wasn't the money, or the hours, or the disrespect. The hardest part was the heartbreak. Watching children walk into a classroom carrying burdens no child should bear. Hunger, poverty, Fear. She saw it in their eyes, in the way some refused to speak, in the way others lashed out. She kept snacks in her desk drawer for the boy who always came to school without breakfast. She bought coats at thrift stores for the girl who shivered through December in a hoodie. She slipped encouraging notes into backpacks for the students who doubted their own worth. Each act of kindness cost her something: money, energy, time. But she gave anyway. Because when a child finally smiled, when they finally believed they mattered, the return was immeasurable. Still, the toll was undeniable. Late at night, alone in her apartment, she sometimes sat at her kitchen table, bills spread out before her. The electric company's envelope sat beside a stack of receipts from school supply purchases. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. More than once she asked herself, "Can I keep doing this?" The answer always came from memory. Faces of students who had written her letters, drawn her pictures, whispered thank you with voices too soft for anyone else to hear. Those memories steadied her hands and kept her moving forward. There were moments when her body protested, a persistent cough ignored until it became pneumonia. Back pain from years of standing, bending, lifting. Headaches from too many sleepless nights. She went to the doctor rarely, always weighing the cost against the need. More often than not, she chose to buy supplies for her students instead of medication for herself. And yet, despite all this, she never stopped showing up. Each morning, she straightened her shoulders, carried her worn bag filled with papers and supplies, and walked into her classroom as though it were a sacred space. Because to her, it was. Her colleagues sometimes asked how she managed. She would smile and shrug, deflecting with humor. But the truth was simple. She endured because quitting wasn't an option. If she left, who would see those children? Who would fight for them? Who would remind them that their lives had value even when the world treated them as invisible? Her sacrifices, though unseen, built invisible bridges. A student who once thought college was impossible found herself applying to universities. Another, whose parents worked 2 jobs and spoke little English, became the first in his family to graduate high school. They returned years later, some with babies on their hips, some in uniforms of their own careers, all saying the same thing: "You believed in me when no one else did." Those words were the fuel that kept her going. They were worth every coin spent, every hour lost, every tear shed. And so, when she stood at that conference and spoke of the children she had seen, of the hunger and the need, the laughter and dismissal from the audience cut deeply, because she knew the price she had paid, she knew the sacrifices she had made, and she knew that her story was not unique. Thousands of teachers across the country carried the same burdens, fought the same battles, endured the same dismissals. What the suits in that hall did not understand was this: every policy they debated, every budget line they slashed, every reform they announced without listening, those decisions landed on the shoulders of teachers like her. And she bore them quietly because someone had to. But humiliation has a strange way of sharpening resolve. And though the conference had dismissed her, her struggles and sacrifices had prepared her for something greater. Because when you've carried the weight of 100 children's futures, the weight of an insult is light by comparison. The second day of the conference was supposed to be about solutions. At least that was how the glossy program described it. Panel after panel filled the stage with polished speakers, superintendents in pressed suits, policymakers armed with graphs, university researchers citing studies. Their slides flickered across the giant screen. Numbers, charts, colourful arrows that bent upward in neat trajectories. Sitting near the back, Margaret listened in silence. Her notebook lay open on her lap, but the pages remained mostly blank. The words spilling from the stage floated like balloons, shiny, colourful, but full of nothing but air. To anyone who had spent years in a real classroom, the disconnect was painful. One speaker spoke about reallocating resources for optimal performance. Another touted standardized testing as the great equalizer. A third bragged about a multi-million-dollar pilot program that had installed interactive boards in suburban classrooms while rural schools still begged for functioning heaters. The audience nodded, clapped, and murmured approval. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. She thought of her students, of the boy who wore the same shirt 3 days in a row, of the girl who came to school hungry. None of this, she realized, touched them. None of this would change their lives. When the moderator invited questions, the line at the microphone formed quickly. Men and women in tailored suits, clutching their conference badges, stepped forward with rehearsed queries designed less to seek answers than to showcase their own importance. Margaret hesitated, her heart pounding. She had spoken once already and been brushed aside. But as she looked at the stage, at the polished smiles and meaningless jargon, something inside her refused to stay quiet. She rose. Her chair scraped against the polished floor, drawing a few curious glances. She joined the line, standing awkwardly among the confident. Some shifted away from her as though she were out of place. In a way, she was. When her turn came, she stepped up to the microphone. The spotlight hit her again, unforgiving. She took a breath. "My name is Margaret. I've been a public school teacher for 23 years. A ripple moved through the crowd. Again, that note of surprise. A teacher. She continued, voice steady. "I've listened to the panels today. I've heard about reallocation, optimization, metrics, but I want to ask something simpler. What do you say to the children who come to school hungry? To the ones who share textbooks 3 to a desk? To the teachers who spend their own paychecks to buy pencils and paper because there isn't enough?" The silence was sharp for a heartbeat. Then came the laughter. Not loud, not uproarious, worse. It was quiet, dismissive, the kind of chuckle that says, "How quaint, how naive." A man near the front smirked, whispering something to his neighbor. 2 women in expensive jewelry exchanged looks and shook their heads. Someone in the back actually clapped sarcastically, the sound muffled, but cutting. The moderator leaned forward, lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for your question, ma'am. But these issues are complex. We're here to talk about policy frameworks and systemic approaches." Margaret gripped the microphone tighter. "Policy means nothing if it doesn't reach the classroom. You talk about frameworks, but I see faces. I see children falling asleep in class because they haven't eaten. I see teachers crying in their cars because they can't give enough. That's not theory. That's reality." A murmur swept the room. Some frowned, uncomfortable. Others outright scoffed. A superintendent shifted in his chair and muttered, "Emotional appeals won't fix the system." A professor scribbled notes, shaking his head. From the stage, one of the panelists leaned into his microphone. "With all due respect," he said smoothly, "teachers often lack the broader perspective required for systemic change. That's why conferences like this are important, to move beyond anecdotal experiences." The words struck like stones. Lack perspective. Anecdotal. She felt heat crawl up her neck. Was 2 decades in classrooms anecdotal? Were the lives of her students mere footnotes in their reports? She opened her mouth to respond, but the moderator cut her off. "Thank you again for your passion," he said briskly, already gesturing to the next questioner. The implication was clear. Her time was over. Margaret stepped back, humiliation crashing over her. She could feel eyes on her, some amused, some pitying, most indifferent. She returned to her seat, her hands trembling. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred. Anger. Not the wild, destructive kind, but the righteous anger of someone who knows the truth and refuses to let it be buried under jargon and laughter. She sat in silence, her chest rising and falling, her eyes fixed on the stage. They had mocked her, dismissed her, belittled her. But they had also revealed something important: their arrogance, their blindness, their distance from the reality of the classrooms they claimed to serve. She picked up her notebook. This time, she began to write. Not notes from the panels, those meant nothing, but her own words, her truth, her voice. She wrote furiously, her pen scratching across the paper, determined that if they wouldn't give her a stage, she would make her own. And though she didn't know it yet, the mockery she endured that day would become the spark that lit a fire across the nation. The final session of the conference was meant to be the grand finale, a panel of nationally recognized experts speaking about the future of education in America. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation, attendees leaning forward as the lights dimmed and the spotlight hit the stage. Suited officials, celebrated professors and policymakers settled into their seats on the platform, smiling for photographs. Margaret sat near the back, her notebook still open on her lap. Its pages were filled now, not with notes from the panels, but with her own words, scribbled sentences, half-finished thoughts, raw truths from the heart of a classroom. The mockery she had endured earlier still echoed in her chest, but it no longer stung the same way. Instead, it had hardened into resolve. As the moderator introduced the final Q&A, Margaret's hands trembled. She knew this was her last chance. She thought of her students, the boy who whispered that she made him feel smart, the girl who blossomed into a debater, the countless faces who carried scars invisible to everyone else. If she didn't speak now, who would speak for them? She rose. The scrape of her chair against the marble floor drew a few curious glances. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady as she made her way to the microphone. When she reached it, the spotlight found her again, harsh and bright. She took a breath. "My name is Margaret," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I'm a public school teacher. 23 years in the classroom." There was a faint ripple of amusement. A few people shifted, already expecting another naive comment to dismiss. She ignored it. She pressed on. "I've listened to 2 days of panels. I've heard about policies, metrics, budgets, frameworks. But I want to tell you about what those words look like when they reach a classroom." She lifted her notebook and read from it, her voice growing stronger. Metrics look like 35 children crammed into a room built for 20. Budgets look like textbooks so old they still list countries that no longer exist. Frameworks look like teachers buying crayons with grocery money because no one else will. The room began to quiet. The chuckles faded. Eyes turned toward her. She closed the notebook, her voice rising with conviction. "You sit here in suits, in chandeliers and marble, talking about reform. Meanwhile, my students come to school hungry. They walk into buildings with leaky roofs, broken heaters, and no internet. And when they fail a test you created, you call them statistics instead of children." Silence deepened. No one laughed now. "I am not here to impress you," she continued, her words cutting through the room like a blade. "I am here to tell you that you are failing them. Not because you don't care, but because you refuse to listen. You dismiss teachers like me as anecdotal. But we are not anecdotes. We are the front line. We see every failure of this system in the faces of our students." A woman in the front row lowered her pen. A man who had been scrolling on his phone looked up, frozen. Margaret's hands shook, but her voice did not falter. Education is not about frameworks. It's about children. It's about the little boy who shares his lunch with his sister because there's not enough at home. It's about the girl who hides in the bathroom because she's ashamed of the holes in her shoes. It's about teachers who cry at night because they know they cannot fix it all, and yet they show up every morning anyway. Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from passion. "You talk about the future of education? The future is already here. It sits in our classrooms every day, waiting for us to notice. And if you don't act, then every chart, every policy, every speech is worthless." The silence was absolute now. The ballroom, once filled with whispers and laughter, had gone still. Hundreds of eyes watched her, some wide, some wet, some ashamed. She drew a final breath. "You laughed at me yesterday. You dismissed me today. But I will not stop speaking for my students, because they cannot stand here. They cannot hold this microphone. So I will." and I will keep speaking until someone finally listens. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Then, slowly, a sound rose, clapping. One pair of hands at first, then another, then dozens. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, applause echoing against the marble walls, rolling like thunder. Margaret stood frozen, overwhelmed. She had not spoken for applause, but for truth. Yet as she looked across the sea of faces, she realized something had shifted. They weren't laughing anymore. They were listening. She stepped back from the microphone, her heart racing, her eyes damp. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for her sacrifices, not for her struggles, but for her voice. And though she didn't know it yet, that voice would carry far beyond the chandeliers of this hall. The conference ended with polite applause for the final panelists, but everyone knew the true climax had not been on stage. It had been at the microphone, when a teacher in a plain navy dress had silenced a room of experts with nothing more than truth. Margaret left the hall quietly, clutching her worn notebook, unaware that someone had recorded every word. A graduate student interning at the event had pulled out her phone the moment Margaret began to speak, instinct telling her this was different from the jargon that filled most of the conference. The video wasn't polished, handheld, shaky at times, with poor lighting, but the rawness made it real. Within hours, she uploaded it to social media with a caption. This teacher just schooled the entire conference. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times. By lunchtime, millions had seen it. The hashtags spread like wildfire. Hashtag listen to teachers, hashtag voices from the classroom, hashtag Margaret speaks. People across the country watched as Margaret's voice echoed through their screens. They heard her speak of children who came to school hungry, of teachers who cried in their cars, of the gap between policy and reality. They saw the way the room shifted, the laughter fading into silence, the standing ovation rising like a wave. Parents commented, "This is exactly what my child's teacher has been saying for years." Teachers replied, "Finally, someone is speaking the truth." For us, students added, "She's talking about my school. She's talking about me." The video cut through divides. City or rural, rich or poor, left or right, everyone recognized the sincerity in her voice. It was not partisan. It was not polished. It was human. News outlets picked it up. At first, small local stations ran the clip under headlines like, "Teacher moves conference to silence." But soon, national networks took notice. The footage aired on morning shows, anchors marveling at the honesty of her words. "It's not every day you see an entire room of experts silenced," one host said. "This wasn't a politician, wasn't a lobbyist. It was a teacher." Margaret herself had no idea. She returned home exhausted, her mind still heavy from the humiliation of being mocked and the strange exhilaration of being heard. She set her notebook on the table, fed her cat, and went to bed early. The next morning, her phone buzzed endlessly. Messages poured in from colleagues, former students, even strangers. "Have you seen this? You're everywhere. You spoke for all of us." Confused, she clicked the link one friend had sent. And there she was, her own face on the screen, her own voice filling the room, but now multiplied across millions of devices. She watched herself grip the microphone, watched the audience fall silent, heard her own words echo back. By the time the video ended, her hands were shaking. She scrolled through the comments, overwhelmed. Teachers from every corner of the country wrote paragraphs about their own struggles. Parents thanked her for saying what they could not. Former students she hadn't heard from in years left messages. "You were my teacher. You changed my life. I'm so proud of you." Tears filled her eyes. For so long, she had felt invisible. Now, suddenly, she was seen by millions. Journalists began calling. One local paper ran a front-page story. The teacher who spoke truth to power. A national magazine published an op-ed titled, "Why We Need More." Margaret's. Invitations flooded her inbox, interviews, podcasts, panels. She declined most at first, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She had never sought fame. But she realized this moment was larger than herself. Her voice was being heard, and with it, the voices of thousands of teachers who had been ignored. On a Sunday morning, she appeared via video call on a national news show. The host introduced her with reverence. "Margaret, you've become the voice of America's teachers. What do you want the country to understand?" Margaret looked into the camera, her hands folded in her lap. Her voice was calm, steady. "I want them to understand that behind every statistic is a child. Behind every test score is a teacher who cares more than you know. We don't need more jargon. We need compassion, resources, and respect. If we want to build the future, we must start by listening to the people in the classrooms." The clip went viral again. More hashtags, more shares, more headlines. Former students began organizing online, creating groups to support her message. They shared stories of how she had changed their lives, how she had bought them supplies, encouraged them when no one else did, told them they were capable when they had stopped believing it themselves. Parents joined in, demanding reforms, citing Margaret's speech as evidence of what needed to change. Within weeks, she became not just a teacher, but a symbol. She embodied every underpaid, overworked, underappreciated educator who had given their heart to children without recognition. And people were listening. But not everyone was pleased. Some policymakers dismissed her as a fad, a viral sensation that would fade. Others bristled at her criticisms, defensive about the systems they had built. Yet, even in criticism, her voice spread further. Every attempt to discredit her only amplified her message. Margaret herself remained humble. She still woke early, still graded papers late into the night, still bought supplies with her paycheck. Her classroom had not changed. But now, when she looked at her students, she carried something new. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the world beyond their walls was finally paying attention. And far beyond what she imagined, powerful eyes were watching too. In the halls of government, in offices of policymakers, her name was being whispered. Not as an anecdote, not as a joke, but as a possibility. Recognition came slowly at first, like a tide creeping over sand. A headline here, a radio interview there. But soon, the tide surged, and Margaret found herself carried by a current she had never expected. Everywhere she turned, someone seemed to know her name. The local paper that once ignored teacher shortages now ran glowing features, from classroom to national stage. National outlets followed with profiles, photographs of her standing in her modest classroom, chalk in hand, sunlight pouring through cracked blinds. The captions read, "The teacher who spoke truth." Her phone buzzed constantly. Former students reached out, some from across the country. One wrote, "You told me I could be more than my circumstances. I believed you. Now I'm in law school. Thank you." Another sent a photo of herself in scrubs with the note, "You once bought me notebooks when my family couldn't. I'm a nurse now. You changed everything." Margaret wept as she read them, overwhelmed by proof that her sacrifices had borne fruit. TV producers invited her onto morning shows. She sat nervously in studios, the lights hot, microphones clipped to her collar. Hosts introduced her with reverence. Please welcome the teacher who silenced an entire conference with just her truth. Margaret smiled shyly, brushing back her hair, her voice steady as she answered questions. She spoke not of herself, but of her students, her colleagues, the countless teachers who shared her struggle. "I am not special," she told one interviewer. "I am one of thousands." The only difference is that, for once, someone listened. Audiences leaned in. Viewers nodded from living rooms and kitchen tables. Emails poured in, thanking her for voicing what so many had felt but never said aloud. She was invited to education forums, this time as a guest of honor. Panels where once she had been dismissed now begged for her participation. She walked into conference halls and people rose to their feet, clapping. The very same types who had laughed at her months earlier now sought her advice, asked her to sit on committees, quoted her words in their speeches. It was disorienting. Recognition was never her goal. Fame sat uneasily on her shoulders, like a coat borrowed from someone else. At times, she longed for the quiet of her classroom, the safe familiarity of children's voices and chalk-streaked hands. But she also knew this moment was larger than her own comfort. She had been given a microphone, and she intended to use it well. Community groups invited her to speak. Parents packed gymnasiums, teachers filled auditoriums, eager to hear her. When she spoke, she didn't lecture. She told stories. Stories of the boy who came to school hungry, the girl who learned to debate her way out of grief, the countless children who only needed one adult to believe in them. Her words carried weight, not because they were polished, but because they were true. Audiences often rose to their feet, tears in their eyes. One evening, she was honored at a local gala. The stage glittered with lights, the crowd in suits and gowns. Margaret wore the same navy dress she'd worn at the conference. When her name was called, the applause thundered. She stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. The MC handed her a crystal plaque, etched with the words, "Champion of Education." Margaret stared at it, humbled. She spoke briefly, her voice trembling. "This plaque is beautiful, but the real reward is the children I get to teach every day. They are the reason we're here. They are the future." The crowd erupted. Some wiped away tears. Recognition also brought new opportunities. Lawmakers began calling, asking for her perspective. She testified before committees, her words recorded in official transcripts. "If you want to understand education," she told them, "don't start with numbers. Start with the children. Start with the teachers who stand in front of them every day." Her testimony spread across news channels, replayed in sound bites that captured her sincerity. Still, she remained grounded. Each morning she returned to her classroom, greeting her students with the same warmth as always. She graded papers late at night, bought supplies on weekends, reminded her children that they mattered. Recognition hadn't changed her work, it had only amplified her voice. The public began to see her as something rare, a truth teller in a world of polished spin. Editorials praised her authenticity. Cartoonists drew her as a teacher holding up a chalkboard, while politicians scrambled to copy her answers. Students at universities studied her speech and communications classes. One national magazine declared her America's teacher. The cover showed her standing in her classroom, chalk dust on her fingers, her eyes bright with determination. She laughed when she saw it, embarrassed. But she also clipped it and tucked it into her notebook, a reminder of how far she'd come. At a rally one spring afternoon, thousands gathered on the steps of a state capitol. Teachers in red shirts held signs, "We stand with Margaret." When she stepped to the microphone, the crowd roared. She lifted her hand, humbled, and said simply, "I stand with you too." Recognition had transformed her from an invisible teacher into a national figure. Yet she never forgot the humiliation at the conference, the smirks, the laughter. It fueled her, reminding her why she had spoken in the first place. Not for applause, not for awards, but for justice, for her students, for teachers everywhere. And beyond the cheers and headlines, in quiet offices where decisions were made, her name began to circulate in a new way. Not just as a symbol, not just as a voice, but as a leader, someone who might carry her convictions into the highest halls of power. Margaret, the teacher once mocked as anecdotal, was now being spoken of as a candidate for Secretary of Education. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped into her mailbox between grocery flyers and utility bills. The envelope was stark white, the seal of the United States embossed in gold. Margaret held it in her hands for a long moment, heart pounding, before sliding a finger under the flap. The words inside seemed almost impossible. "The President of the United States requests the honor of your presence at the White House." For a woman who had spent her life in classrooms with peeling paint and broken desks, the idea of walking through the marble halls of power felt surreal. She showed the letter to no one at first, afraid it might vanish like a dream if she spoke it aloud. When the day arrived, she wore her plain navy dress again, the same one she had worn at the conference. She didn't own anything more formal, and even if she had, she would have chosen the dress anyway. It had become a symbol, a reminder of where she had begun. She pinned her hair neatly, carried her worn notebook in her bag, and boarded a plane bound for Washington, D.C. The White House loomed before her, its columns gleaming in the sunlight, the American flag rippling above. Secret Service agents guided her through security, their professionalism both intimidating and reassuring. She walked across polished floors that had felt the weight of history, past portraits of leaders and presidents, until she was ushered into the Oval Office. The president rose to greet her. He extended his hand warmly. "Margaret," he said, as though they were old friends, "it's an honor to finally meet you." She shook his hand, her own trembling slightly. "The honor is mine, Mr. President." They sat together, sunlight streaming through tall windows. The president spoke first. "I've watched your speech a dozen times. The way you silenced that conference, it wasn't just powerful, it was necessary. This country needs leaders like you. Leaders who understand what's happening in real classrooms, not just in policy papers." Margaret blinked, struggling to process his words. "I'm just a teacher," she said softly. The president smiled. "And that's exactly why I'm asking you this. Margaret, I want to nominate you as the next Secretary of Education." The room seemed to tilt. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Secretary of Education? She thought of her classroom back home, of her students bent over their notebooks, of the broken radiator that clanked through winter mornings. She thought of the laughter at the conference, the dismissal, the mockery, and now here she was, being asked to lead the very system that had ignored her. Her voice trembled. "Mr. President, I'm not a politician. I've never even thought about a role like this." "That's why you're perfect," he replied. "We've had enough politicians. We need someone who knows the truth, who has lived it. We need someone who remembers that education isn't about numbers, it's about children. You've already inspired millions. Now, I want you to help change the system for good." Tears welled in her eyes. She thought of her students again, their faces flashing before her like a reel of film. Could she do this? Could she carry their stories into the highest office of the land? "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. "No one ever is," the president said gently. "But you are willing, and that's enough." The announcement came 2 days later. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for space in the briefing room. The president stepped up to the podium. "Today, I am proud to nominate Margaret, an extraordinary teacher from a small town who has spent over 20 years in the classroom, as the next Secretary of Education." Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding, the cameras clicking like thunder. She stood beside the president, her hands clasped, her heart racing. When it was her turn to speak, she moved to the microphone. The world seemed to hold its breath. "I am deeply humbled," she began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I never imagined standing here. I never sought power or recognition. I sought only to teach, to care for children who needed someone to believe in them, to fight for classrooms that too often go unseen. But today, I accept this nomination not for myself, but for every teacher who has ever felt invisible, for every child who has ever been overlooked, for every parent who has prayed for something better." Her words carried the same authenticity that had silenced the conference months earlier. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed closer, viewers at home leaned forward. "I may be one woman, but I carry the voices of thousands," she continued. "And I promise you this, I will not forget where I came from. I will not forget the children who inspired me. And I will not rest until every classroom in America has the dignity and resources it deserves." The room erupted in applause. Some reporters even stood. The president placed a hand on her shoulder, pride in his eyes. That night, her face appeared on every news channel. The headlines flashed across screens. Teacher turned secretary, a new chapter in education. From classroom to cabinet. The voice of Teachers reaches Washington. Back home, her students watched on television. They pointed at the screen, wide-eyed, whispering, "That's my teacher." Parents gathered in living rooms, teachers in staff lounges, all shaking their heads in wonder. Margaret, the woman once mocked as anecdotal, was now stepping into the highest role in American education. She lay awake that night in a hotel near the White House, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. She thought of the challenges ahead, the battles waiting in Congress, the entrenched systems resistant to change. But she also thought of the moment at the conference, when she had gripped the microphone and refused to be silenced. She had not sought this path, but perhaps it had sought her. And as sleep finally claimed her, she whispered a promise to herself. "I will carry the classroom into every room I enter. I will make them see what they tried so hard to ignore." The title on her office door read, Secretary of Education, engraved in brass. The office itself gleamed, mahogany desk polished to a shine, shelves lined with volumes of policy and law, tall windows overlooking the Capitol. Staffers bustled in and out, schedules printed by the hour, phones ringing with requests from governors, senators, reporters. But Margaret never forgot that she was still, at her core, a teacher. On her first morning in office, she placed a small worn item on her desk, a jar of pencils. Each one sharpened, their erasers already chewed and faded. They were from her last classroom, gathered into the jar by her students as a goodbye gift. She kept it front and center, a reminder that behind every policy were children who had once reached for these pencils. Her aides suggested she start with ceremonial events, photo ops, speeches in marble halls. Margaret shook her head. "The children don't live in marble halls," she said. "I want to see the classrooms first." And so she did. Within her first month, she visited schools across the country. She walked into a crumbling elementary school in the Mississippi Delta, where paint peeled from the walls and the library shelves stood nearly empty. She crouched beside a little girl struggling with her reading, her hand gentle on the child's shoulder, whispering encouragement. The cameras caught the moment, but Margaret wasn't posing. She was teaching. She traveled to rural Montana, where students rode buses 2 hours each way to attend class. She listened as teachers explained how difficult it was to keep staff, how technology lagged decades behind. Margaret took notes furiously in her old notebook, just as she always had. "Tell me what you need," she insisted. "Tell me what would make this better." In a crowded city high school, she sat in a circle with teenagers, not at a podium, but on a folding chair among them. They spoke candidly about overcrowded classrooms, violence in their neighborhoods, the crushing pressure of standardized tests. Margaret listened, her face intent, nodding. "You are not data points," she told them. "You are people, and you deserve better." Her authenticity startled many. Previous secretaries of education had been distant, focused on numbers and politics. Margaret was different. She hugged teachers in hallways. She ate lunch in cafeterias with students. She asked janitors and bus drivers about their lives, taking notes as though their words carried as much weight as any senator's. Because to her, they did. The press followed her everywhere. Headlines read, "A secretary in the halls, not just the halls of power." From chalk dust to cabinet, Margaret redefines leadership. But Margaret avoided the spotlight whenever possible. She didn't chase cameras. The cameras chased her. In Washington, she fought fiercely. In meetings with lawmakers, she brought photographs of classrooms she had visited. Broken desks, leaking ceilings, children wrapped in coats during winter lessons. She laid the photos on the mahogany tables of Congress and asked, "Would you want your children sitting here?" Silence often followed. Her opponents squirmed, unused to such bluntness. Policy debates grew heated, but Margaret's voice carried the authority of lived experience. When others spoke in abstractions, she countered with stories. She didn't say, "We need increased funding for nutritional programs." She said, "I sat with a boy in Ohio who hadn't eaten since yesterday. He fell asleep on his desk because hunger does that to a child. Will you fund him, or will you let him starve?" Her words cut through the fog of politics. Some dismissed her as too emotional, but millions of Americans rallied to her side. Parents, teachers, students flooded her office with letters of support. Social media campaigns surged, #MargaretListens, #From Classroom to Cabinet. Despite the weight of her office, Margaret kept her habits. She rose early, brewed her coffee, and wrote notes longhand in her notebook. She called teachers directly, surprising them with personal thanks. She still clipped coupons for school supplies, mailing boxes of crayons and pencils to classrooms that reminded her of her own. Her staff urged her to delegate more, to embrace the grandeur of her position. But Margaret resisted. "A leader isn't someone above," she told them. "A leader stands beside." Perhaps the most moving moment came when she returned to her old school. The children lined the halls, holding handmade signs. "Welcome back, Mrs. Margaret." Her former colleagues embraced her, tears streaming. She walked into her old classroom, touched the chipped desk, the scratched chalkboard, the window that rattled when the wind blew. "This," she whispered, "is where I learned how to lead." Her visit was not symbolic. It was personal. She told the children, "I may work in Washington now, but I will always be a teacher, and every decision I make will be with you in mind." That day, she didn't leave empty-handed. The students gave her another gift, a stack of letters. In shaky handwriting and colorful crayon, they wrote things like, "Please fix the heaters. We need more books. Thank you for helping us." She carried those letters back to Washington and laid them on her desk beside the jar of pencils. They became her compass. Margaret, the once dismissed teacher, had become a national leader, but she never lost the humility of her classroom. She understood that true leadership wasn't about titles or prestige or power. It was about service. It was about remembering that every policy touched a child's life. And though the road ahead was steep, Margaret was determined. She had once been laughed at, mocked, dismissed as anecdotal. Now she stood at the highest table of education in America, still carrying the voices of her students. And soon, she would return to the very conference that had ridiculed her. This time, not as a forgotten teacher, but as the Secretary of Education. The ballroom looked exactly as she remembered it. Grand chandeliers, polished marble, velvet drapes framing tall windows. The same rows of tables covered in white linen, the same hushed conversations rising into the air like static before a storm. But this time, Margaret did not sit at the back, clutching a registration badge. This time, she walked to the stage as the United States Secretary of Education. Gasps rippled through the room as her name was announced. Reporters scrambled for photos, lenses flashing like bursts of lightning. Attendees who once ignored her now craned their necks, whispering. Some who had laughed at her the year before shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Margaret stepped onto the stage in her navy dress. Not designer, not new, the same dress she had worn when they mocked her. She wore it deliberately, as a reminder. In her hand, she carried her worn notebook, its pages crammed with stories, letters, and faces from classrooms across America. The moderator, visibly nervous, greeted her with a handshake. "Madam Secretary," he said with forced cheer. She returned a calm smile, then turned to face the hall. Silence fell. She placed the notebook on the podium, rested her hands on either side, and let her eyes sweep across the room. Hundreds of faces stared back at her. She thought of the moment she had stood here before, her words drowned by chuckles and smirks. This time, no one laughed. Her voice rang clear. "A year ago, I stood in this very hall. I spoke about children who come to school hungry, about teachers who spend their own paychecks on supplies, about classrooms falling apart. And I was laughed at." The words hung heavy. Some shifted in their seats, shame flickering across their faces. I was told my experiences were anecdotal, that I lacked perspective. But let me tell you, there is no greater perspective than the front of a classroom, and there is nothing anecdotal about the lives of millions of children. Applause began softly, scattered. She raised her hand gently, and the room stilled again. In the past year, I have traveled this nation. I have sat with children in classrooms that leak when it rains. I have held the hands of teachers who cry at night because they cannot give more than they already give. I have read letters from students who dream of futures bigger than their circumstances, and I have carried their voices here. She opened the notebook, pulled out one of the crayon-written letters from her old school. Holding it up, she said, "This is why I stand here. A child asked me to fix the heaters. A child begged for more books. This," she tapped the page gently, "is policy, not graphs, not jargon. The voices of our children are the only data that matter." The room was silent, spellbound. Margaret leaned forward, her voice softening, but carrying strength. "You laughed before because you did not see me. You did not see the millions of teachers who stand in classrooms every day, unseen, unheard. But today, I stand here not for myself, but for them. For every teacher who has ever been dismissed, for every child who has ever been overlooked. We are not anecdotes. We are America's foundation." Applause surged again, louder this time. People rose to their feet in pockets, then in waves, until the entire hall was standing. The sound thundered, echoing off marble and chandeliers. Margaret stood still, her eyes glistening, humbled by the sight. She waited for quiet, then closed with words she had carried since that first humiliating day. Do not underestimate the power of a teacher's voice. It can silence a room, it can move a nation, and it can change the future. The hall erupted. People cheered, clapped, some even wept. Those who had once mocked her now stood with respect. And Margaret, once invisible, now commanded the room with nothing but truth. As she stepped back from the podium, she caught sight of faces in the crowd. Teachers with tears in their eyes, students holding signs of support, officials nodding solemnly. Redemption was not about proving her critics wrong. It was about proving her students right. Proving that their lives, their struggles, their dreams mattered enough to be spoken in the halls of power. She left the stage to a standing ovation that did not fade, even as she walked out of the ballroom and into the crisp night air. The same autumn breeze that had once carried humiliation now carried triumph. She breathed it in deeply, her heart steady. Margaret had come full circle, from dismissed teacher to the nation's Secretary of Education, from laughter to ovation. But more than titles, more than recognition, she had given teachers and students something priceless, a voice that could no longer be ignored. And as she walked away from the glowing windows of the conference hall, she whispered the same vow she had carried all along. This is only the beginning.